That then brings us to the adaptive strategies that are based on food production. There are three adaptive strategies based in food production that are found in non industrial societies. Those three are horticulture, agriculture, which really can be seen as two ends of a cultivation spectrum, and then pastoralism. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. Horticulture is defined as non industrial plant cultivation with fallowing. Horticulturalists use simple tools. We're talking about hand tools. We're not talking about so digging sticks and handheld hoes, not large machinery. These fields are not permanently cultivated. That's what it means by having a fallow period. There will be long periods of time, often years, where these fields are not cultivated. Horticulturalists, in many cases, make use of slash and burn, which is where they cut down the vegetation from a particular plot, then they burn it, then they till the ashes into the soil. And what that does is it supplements the soil. It makes the soil richer. It particularly puts a lot of nitrogen back into the soil. Horticulture is also termed shifting cultivation. And from this viewpoint, we're talking about shifting between plots of land. So, in areas like dense tropical rainforest, we find a particular pattern of horticulture called swidden horticulture. And this is what's shown with both of these pictures here. Swidden agriculture or Swidden horticulture is a tropical, a moist kind of practice. And so you're taking all of the material from a plot of land, which often can include large trees, right? You're cutting all those trees down, you're burning them, you're reintroducing that nitrogen into the soil. Then you're using hand tools to cultivate garden plots. After the soil is exhausted, because it will be in a matter of about 5 years, then you allow the forest to reclaim that plot of land. Because of this, it can be pretty land intensive because a group is going to have to not only own the land that they've got being cultivated currently, but also own all the plots of land that are currently lying fallow. So we see a pretty heavy reliance on having access to relatively large plots of land. Um, the difference then between horticulture and agriculture is kind of a level of complexity or a level of intensity. Agriculture is cultivation that uses land and labor continuously and intensively. Okay. Agriculture requires for fields to be permanently cultivated, basically, because it's associated, of course, with that increase in population density and those cultural changes that we've already talked about. Many agriculturalists use domesticated animals as a means of production. That is, that not only do you eat your animals, but you also use your animals as like plow or draft animals. And so, specifically, a lot of changes come about culturally once societies develop the plow and start using the plow. And the reason that's associated with a lot of changes in cultural features is because plows make the agriculture that's being practiced a male dominated task. Generally, people think that only males, because of their larger body size and increased strength, only males can operate the draft animals that are necessary to pull the plow. That turns the actual kind of farming into more of a status or prestige activity. This is that point where we get the notion of women being barefoot and pregnant, right? The idea that when agriculture moves from involving both sexes to involving only one sex, then that agriculture or then that shift is going to come along with shifts that are associated with women losing status and prestige. Women being removed from the production of food leads to overall lower status among women. And so is a kind of cultural, let's say, trifecta that comes that works really heavily to lower women's status. When we see the emergence of more intensive agriculture, when we see the emergence of endemic warfare, we start to see the male supremacist concept or the male supremacist complex emerge, which overall leads to much more significant gender stratification. All right, so domesticated animals that, in many cases, historically removed women from production for the first time in human history. Agriculture also makes use of irrigation. They will, after all, cultivate the same plot of land year after year. um, the fields are seen as a capital investment that increase in value, particularly when you're using river water to irrigate. This is something that doesn't hold true in modern times with industrial agriculture, and that is because we're using sterilized municipal water sources to irrigate. When we're using the river to irrigate, we introduce all of the decaying plant material, the fecal material of whatever animals utilize that river, and all of the microbes that come along with it. And so, watering with river water is very good for your land, does reintroduce a lot of the nutrients, and allows you to increase your yield over time in that plot of land. So an example here is with the Ifugao of the Philippines. They use canals from rivers, streams, springs, and ponds, and it's a system very much like our acequia or ditch system that we have in the North and South Valley here in Albuquerque. In mountainous areas, agriculture also makes use of terracing. You wouldn't find this among horticultural populations. And so that's what this bottom picture shows is a terraced hillside. Terracing can be good. It allows you to farm land that would have traditionally been harder to access. But the problem comes when you've got a lot of, I mean, because terracing is happening on mountainsides. Mountains are notorious for having a lot of minerals, right? And so terracing, because of that, can lead to soil exhaustion in the fields that are lower down. What terracing does is keeps your agricultural fields from kind of running off, right? You're not going to lose your plants. Because you've kind of built out a system to have these stair steps um, that kind of keep your dirt and your soil and your plants where they need to be. Um, the labor, though, to build these systems of terraces is incredibly high, and these terraces are vulnerable to kind of the salt sterilizing them, basically, the salt kind of leaching out of the mountainside into your fields and essentially shutting down or making your soil for infertile, sterile. All right, so agriculture and horticulture represent two continuums of like this same entity, right? They also both have some cultural features that are associated with them. And I don't have some of this information on the slide, but I'm still going to go ahead and share it with you. We'll talk about it a little more pointedly as we discuss horticulturalists. Okay. I had mentioned as we had our slide on horticulture, I had mentioned that we have this Swidden horticulture that's present in dense tropical rainforest areas. I do want to share with you that that's not the only type of horticulture there is. There is also dry land farming, which is really a form of horticulture, despite the inclusion of the word farming. And that is what the ancestral Puebloans and modern Puebloans have practiced here in New Mexico. Okay, so when we talk about dry land farming, we're not talking about farming per se because it's not continuous cultivation of the same plots of land that um, either increase in value or end up becoming exhausted, right? Dryland farming is a form of horticulture where you're planting garden plots, yes, but you're planting them in a variety of different kind of microclimates or micro ecologies. And so it is gardening because of the kind of intensity of it, but you hedge your bets by planting it in a lot of different places. So, if you plant your garden plots in the dry riverbeds, right? The benefit might be if you get rainfall, those dry riverbeds will hold the water, right? But the cost of that, or the possible problem with that is that if you have a really rich monsoon season, anything planted in those dry riverbeds is going to run dry, or it's going to be washed out, right? That in a really, really active monsoon system, there'll be so much flooding that those crops will be washed out. You can also plant in higher areas, right? When you plant in higher areas, you're not going to see things washed out or wash away in monsoons, right? But if it's not a reasonable monsoon season, you're also not going to see enough moisture to be able to make those areas fruitful. And so, this dry farming or dryland farming that was done by uh, ancestral Puebloans here in New Mexico really exists as a way to kind of hedge your bets. Really exists as a way to make sure that at least some of your crops will be harvestable, um, even if you accept that you've got a certain level of loss that you're going to experience. Okay, so some different methods and kind of mechanisms of deciding where to plant and why we either classify something as agricultural or horticultural. Before we move on to what's on this slide, I also want to bring up some of these cultural correlates. So we talked about how foragers exist in band level sociopolitical systems, right? Well, horticulturalists exist in what we call uh, tribal level organization. And so tribes are present when you've got multiple villages of the same people. It is associated, at least in a horticultural context, with sedentism, though we also have tribal organization among pastoralists as well. Um, Tribes, when you compare across the villages, there is no difference in status from village to village. So all of the villages are equally esteemed. That being said, it is, of course, absolutely possible for individual people to have higher social status. So that in many cases in tribal organization, we have a position called the village head, can also be called the big man. Um, this is someone who kind of leads by example. He's known for being a good hunter, perhaps, or a good farmer, but also being known for being generous. And these people in these leadership roles often have um, what you would call charisma. They're often very likable. They know how to woo people, and because of it, they're able to get a lot of people to support them. So we find this kind of tribal organization still present on a number of the islands that are in Oceania, that are like in the Pacific Ocean. So places like Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, we still see some of this tribal organization. When we shift to agriculture, we are almost always talking about chiefdoms and or um, estates. And so as you look through the archaeological record, you will find both in a modern context. If a population practices agriculture, they are part of a larger state level socio-political system. Of course, it's hard to say that anybody is really separated from state level socio-political systems, but um, it is very much, we see this association of agriculture and the state. So when we talk about the costs and benefits of agriculture, the long-term yield per area is greater and more dependable than horticulture. That doesn't mean that in any single growing season, though, that you're going to be doing better by practicing agriculture. Agricultural societies also tend to be more densely populated than horticultural ones. The other aspect, though, because these agricultural societies are often organized at the state level, is precisely what you see here. These are migrant farm workers on the west coast of the United States. Okay, so when we talk about who's doing the actual agricultural labor, by and large, anywhere in the world, we're not talking anymore about family farms, right? I mean, maybe in some isolated cases, but um, by and large, even as we look through the historical record, the archaeological record, right, the work was done by peasants, the work was done by the proletariat, by the commoners, by the landless, the serfs, etc., whatever word we want to use to describe them in our particular economic context, right? The work is done by the poor in order to benefit the wealthy. So that is true really everywhere in the world. So this cultivation continuum refers to the use of both land and labor. There are intermediate economies that have elements of both that are horticultural and agricultural, so to speak. Some of these areas, particularly in like Polynesia, they would be chiefdoms and agricultural, even though kind of at the island level, they look more horticultural and tribal. And that is because then uh, in some of these island systems where you've got basically like one village per island, you can get support kind of across several islands. Horticulture, so if you're looking at a particular cultivation situation and you need to make the decision as to whether it's agriculture or horticulture, you are going to look for that fallow period. And that fallow period does not count as planting a winter crop. You know, one of the common things with a lot of the agriculture throughout the Midwest here in the United States is that you plant alfalfa during the winter as a cover crop. That is not a fallow period. Okay, so having just a single season where nothing's planted on the land, or where only something like alfalfa is planted on the land, it still qualifies as agriculture. So you're looking for specifically letting those fields be reclaimed by nature, and this fallow period of really on the scope of years. So until relatively recently, there were intermediate economies found in parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands, Mexico, Central America, and the South American tropical forests. These are being pushed aside by larger agribusiness and machines, basically. I don't mean like an actual physical machine, but the agribusiness is driving the loss of even family farms, even here in the United States, right? Farming is becoming a lost art, and most of the agriculture that's done here in the United States is industrialized agriculture that focuses on monocropping and patenting seeds and what you grow from those seeds, etc. So intensive cultivators tend to be sedentary. Sedentism comes even with this Swidden agriculture in tropical rainforest, right? Why on earth would you water and tend to gardens if you weren't going to be there to be able to reap the benefits of that? As agricultural economies grow, they become increasingly specialized. They generally focus on one or only a few caloric staples. And this is true both in terms of the plant resources they grow as well as the animals that they utilize. So we don't find rich menageries of animals in these agricultural systems, right? You're going to have draft horses or draft oxen or something of the sort to be able to pull your plow. And then you're going to supplement with maybe some poultry or sheep or goats or something like that. Agricultural economies also pose a series of regulatory issues that result in the formation of central governments. And so that is why we're able to see agricultural economies grow to such massively large, um, even empires, right? When we look back through the historical and the archaeological record, and we're talking about how large some of these agricultural populations have gotten, we're talking about on the scope of empires, not just a single state, right? So these regulatory issues, as you grow in size and as you grow in complexity, these regulatory issues become larger and harder to deal with. And so in a lot of cases, when we see empire spread, right, you reach a point where, particularly when the leader of that population can't make it to the farthest reaches of his polity, right, that there isn't really much I don't know, it's like you kind of outgrow yourself, that there's a scope to which and a size to which even agricultural populations have a hard time surpassing. All right, so that brings us to pastoralism. Pastoralists are herders. They are people whose activities focus on domesticated animals like cattle, sheep, goats, camels, yak, and reindeer. There are, for example, among groups like the Sami, in like Lapland and Siberia, there are groups that are essentially just reindeer herders. Pastoralists and their animals form a symbiotic relationship. When we talk about symbiosis in biology, we're talking about something that is mutually beneficial to both of the parties that are present. So these obligatory interactions. So let's think for a moment as to what we get from the animals, right? That's pretty self-explanatory. We get food, probably get milk. We're going to get leather, maybe a dairying tradition, etc. What do the animals need from us or get from us? Well, one of the things that we talked about in our agriculture lecture was the fact that as you get rid of defense mechanisms in animals while you domesticate them, that you're basically requiring that they rely on humans for protection, right? So that is one of the ways that our animals benefit from us. Another way, and this is associated particularly with, well, I mean, as we domesticate them, and if we're using them for food or if we're using them even for dairying, right, we're selecting for certain features like high milk production, like a certain body size, a certain like fat uh, to lean meat ratio, etc. And in some cases, that makes reproduction harder. You've selected for example, smaller body size among your adult females, but when you reduce body size among females, that makes it harder for those females to then give birth. So that's another area where humans have to become involved. And so livestock often need humans to help them ensure their reproduction, whether that's the pairing of them, right, finding them a mate, etc., or whether that's the actual physical act of giving birth. That's what, for example, large animal vets may help with, right? It's when animals get stuck in the birth canal during labor and delivery. So pastoralist populations do sometimes directly consume their animals. But what's far more common is basing their diet on animal products rather than the actual animals themselves. And so they're not eating like steaks every night if they're cattle herders, right? Instead, they're basing most of their diet on milk and cheese and only consuming an animal when it's like ceremonially dictated to do so, or there's an animal that needs to be culled from the herd, or they're trying to impress neighboring groups, or etc. Pastoralists also supplement their diets by hunting, gathering, fishing, cultivating, or trading. Specifically, one of the things that needs to go hand in hand with pastoralism, you've got to have some consumption of grains. And so that means you need a method or a mechanism by which you can guarantee that you have access to grains. And so this can happen in a couple of ways. This can happen in one of the patterns of movement that we're going to talk about in just a sec called transhumant pastoralism. That is, part of your population can actually grow the carbohydrate crops that you need if part of your population stays put. But it can also be accomplished through trade networks and partnerships with other food producing societies. And so there is something that Barth calls a plural society, which is a very effective way at pseudo multiculturalism, where two populations that have very different ecological niches are able to coexist very peacefully by complementing each other. And so we find this among agriculturalists and pastoralists throughout, like the Middle East, for example, or throughout the Eurasian steppes, the Central Asian kind of areas. So in this context, there may be two different separate societies, one which farms and uses the pastoralists for access to domesticated animals or milk or dairy products, whereas the other one then is doing the herding and utilizing the fruits of that other society's agricultural labor. All right, so pastoralism was confined to the Old World until Europeans brought domesticated animals to the New World. Native populations in the New World, though, have capitalized upon that access. And so there is a type of sheep that's that's grown or ranched pretty widely in the desert Southwest called the churro. And no, we're not talking about fried dough. And they are also sometimes referred to as Navajo sheep. So we have had some incredible kind of reliance and then proliferation of like art and such that make use of animal products from introducing these herding strategies and animals themselves, species, into our local indigenous populations. I mean, it's what's really behind the weaving that the Navajo are so famous for, right? Was the introduction of the churro as a sheep for them to herd. So there are two patterns of movement among pastoralists. The first is nomadism. This is when the entire group moves with the animals throughout the year. And so there is an area called the Sahel, Sahel. It is the area immediately to the south of the Sahara Desert. The Sahel is historically been populated by nomads, by nomadic pastoralists. And they've got seasonal patterns of movement and kind of complex um, cultural features and societies that allow them to guarantee access to herd lands and such. And this includes like the Bedouins and such, the Berbers, etc. When we talk about nomadism, we generally have some sort of relationship with food producing societies to be able to trade for or buy the carbohydrates that the society needs, that the people need to be able to survive. So they'll trade for crops with other products with more sedentary people during their movement. Transhumant is the other style of movement, and that is where part of the group moves with the herds, but most people stay at home in sedentary villages. And so this is the kind of the pastoral situation where you can find you find farming, right? Where part of the population, oftentimes the older men and the women, stay home in the village and take care of that agricultural labor, while the like teenage boys and such are off working as shepherds and driving their livestock up the mountain during the summer and down the mountain during the winter. We have transhumant pastoralism in New Mexico when we look at like grazing rights and what we do with our animals, right? So we have a cabin up in Tres Piedras, and when we're up there and we're going out hiking and stuff like that, during the summer you find these temporary cattle camps that set up all along the San Juans there. And the same thing happens in the Jemez, where you've got local ranchers who lease grazing rights in the forest land and will drive their livestock up into the forests during the height of the summer, so that because it's not as hot and dry and you don't really run out of the grass up there. So during the summer, they're driven up the mountain. During the winter, they come back down the mountain. In many places in the mountainous areas of Europe, you actually end up having fall and spring festivals that surround or are kind of driven by the movement of the herds. So there'll be some kind of a spring festival that celebrates the birth of new lambs and yada yada, right? And then some sort of fall festival that recognizes like the importance of the harvest and the meat coming back home sort of thing. So I've got a friend who is from a small village in Italy, and like, he would take pictures and send us videos of like it would really shut down like the streets through the area because during the spring and during the fall the streets would be filled with the shepherds moving their flocks of sheep up and down the mountain. All right, so this is just a good summary table of these adaptive strategies, right? Of how they or the key features of the varieties that you find, and other names for them.